Great. All right. Hey everyone, I'm Jen DeAugustine. I am the chair-elect for the Wildlife Society's Renewable Energy Working Group, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining our webinar today. We have a few quick announcements, and then I'll introduce our presenters. Just a friendly reminder that we have an upcoming renewable energy symposium that will be going on at the annual conference in Spokane, Washington. That is going to be on Wednesday, November 9th. It is all day, 8:30 to 5:30. It will be in ballroom 111A. Also, during that symposium, we will be having a lunch, provided lunch for our members meeting, but it's really open to anybody. So if you want to come talk about what the Renewable Energy Working Group is doing, what we're working on, our goals for next year and things like that, we will be having that luncheon is from 12 to 1:30. So definitely, if you are going to be in Spokane at the conference, please consider coming by and joining us. And with that, I am going to introduce our presenters today. It is Michael Zehner of the Berkley Group, and I believe he has a few other people on with him from the Berkley Group who might be presenting as well. So I will go ahead and let them kind of introduce themselves. But I'm very familiar with them as I'm based out of Richmond, Virginia, and I know that they do a lot of third-party reviews for local land use permits, and they help localities develop their comprehensive plans and their zoning ordinances, especially for utility scale solar. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. I'd love to hear more about the work they're doing. So I will pass it over to you, Michael.
Great, thanks, Jen. Let me go ahead and share the PowerPoint. And with me today, Lindsay Edwards, environmental planner, and Luke Peters, an environmental planner. Luke will help out with the presentation. Lindsay was planning to, but has developed a sore throat and difficulty speaking. So I'll pinch hit for her on some of these slides. So bear with me one second. Let me get this started. So yeah, thanks again for having us for this opportunity. Again, my name is Michael Zehner. I'm the Environmental Programs Director with the Berkley Group. And today we're going to go over our experiences in planning, regulating, and permitting utility scale solar facilities. And outlined in our description for the session, we have seen significant increases in the development of utility scale solar in the last 5 years, both in the number and size of projects. And these increases are occurring across the country in states, localities, and on sites with varying geographies and conditions. And they present new and differing challenges and impacts to land uses and natural resources. And our presentation will address utility scale solar in the context of national and state levels, and then review our experiences assisting local governments, as Jen indicated, in considering reviewing and permitting utility scale solar facilities. So about us briefly, in our involvement, a quick overview of our agenda. We'll go over the Berkley Group, our involvement with utility scale solar. We'll talk about what utility scale solar is, what constitutes that, and from our perspective. And then we'll discuss the national and state context, what's occurring at the national level and state levels, and drill down to Virginia, where most of our experience is. And then finally, for the majority of the session, we'll discuss local context and experiences, focusing on the importance of planning and establishing policies for utility scale solar, developing specific standards for the use, and using best practices for conducting permit reviews of projects. We hope to highlight the relationship and impacts of this use on wildlife and natural resources and mitigation considerations for those impacts. So about the Berkley Group, again, it's myself, Lindsay Edwards, and Luke Peters, as well as Nadia Siaza, an intern with us who's working on her master's in planning at Virginia Commonwealth University. So the Berkley Group is principally a local government consulting firm. All of our clients our government entities. And while we have experience working with all levels of government, we principally serve regional, county, city, and town governments. And I would say almost specifically with respect to utility scale solar, our activity is at the county level. And largely that's because of the land sizes and the project sizes we're talking about. Our principal services are traditional planning and land use, executive level assistance and recruitment, human resources, and auxiliary and virtual town hall services, as well as through our team, the environmental programs team, environmental planning services. With regard to solar, as well as also wind and more recently hydrogen power generation, we assist local governments with the consideration of these land uses, as well as the review of development proposals. And for us, this really started almost 5 years ago when one of our co-founders, Darren Coffey, worked with Mecklenburg County, Virginia, on the review of several utility scale solar projects. And out of that experience, it resulted in his development of a American Planning Association Planning Advisory Services memo on planning for utility scale solar facilities, as well as supporting more recently the joint solar at scale guide developed by the American Planning Association and ICMA through a US Department of Energy technical assistance grant. Essentially, we've gained a level of expertise through experience reviewing a number of projects in a variety of communities. At present, we're reviewing 15 active solar projects in 4 localities in Virginia and in Colorado, and are working with another locality to develop policies and regulatory amendments for both solar and wind. And in the last year, we've also worked with a county in Kansas that was considering utility scale solar as well. An important disclaimer, we are principally planners and generalists. Lindsay's background is certainly, educational background is in environmental science as well as GIS, but the majority of our environmental experience is practical. We're not engineers, we're not technical professionals or scientists or researchers. We approach these projects from a planning perspective, and we hope that that means we take a broad approach, focusing on all of the issues, including the relationship between these projects and the natural environment. So first, what is utility scale solar? And generally, we define this as any facility greater than 1 megawatts in rated electrical generation capacity as a commercial, intended to commercially generate electricity, rather than integrated rooftop mounted solar accessory facilities that may be net metered or used for on-site consumption, which usually are considerably smaller. And often we are working with communities, we define these as medium scale, 1 to 5 megawatts, or large scale 5 megawatts and greater. And in terms of size, a good rule of thumb is that on average 10 acres of project or site area is needed for 1 megawatts of capacity. And I would say we are seeing that number reduce, and there's a lot of variability there, and it's dependent on site conditions as well. But this image on the right is an example of a 80 megawatt facility on 800 acres. So you can get some sense of size and scale. Another way to look at it for context, if anyone's familiar with Washington, D.C., a 20-acre project, which would hypothetically have a rated generation capacity of 2 megawatts, would be approximately the size of the White House complex, the White House site. While a 5,000-acre, 500 megawatt project would cover an area the length of the National Mall, but several blocks wider. So what do we commonly see in terms of equipment for these facilities? Obviously, the photovoltaic panels, the PV panels, and racking, inverters that are used to convert DC to AC power, substation, switchyard, generator lead lines that interconnect to a grid transmission line. And we're also seeing facilities may also include battery energy storage systems. That's becoming more common to manage loads and distribution of electricity at times where there is a need for it. And also fairly standard is fencing for security and safety. So the national context for these. So nationwide, we're seeing a large growth in renewables and especially solar. It is the fastest growing energy source in the world at present. And since 2010, the United States has seen an increase in installed solar energy generating capacity, growing from approximately 2 gigawatts in 2010 to approximately 130 gigawatts installed by the first half of 2022. And to help with the math a little bit, 1 gigawatt equals 1,000 megawatts. And the increase in solar is due to several factors. The cost of solar energy, facility technology has decreased dramatically, approximately 80% since 2010. There is a growing demand for renewably generated energy from the private sector. And more than 370 of Fortune 500's companies have 100% renewable procurement goals. We're also seeing the instability in the availability and costs of traditional fossil fuels due to geopolitical conditions, state policies and incentives to achieve carbon emissions goals and to reduce reliance upon fossil fuels. And when I go into talking about Virginia experiences, you'll see how that kind of manifests itself. And then also economic and financial opportunity for landowners, especially farmers, and as well as communities themselves. So perhaps 5 to 10 years ago, when someone mentioned a solar farm, this is the type of location that we would envision. You know, a dry, certainly a lot of sun, desert-like environment, largely devoid of significant topographic changes and vegetation. This particular facility is the Solar Star facility. It's made up of Solar Star 1 and Solar Star 2. It's located in Kern and Los Angeles counties in California, approximately 60 miles north of downtown Los Angeles in the Antelope Valley. It was completed in 2015. And when it was completed, well, it's currently America's largest solar farm. It was actually the biggest in the world when it was completed in June of 2015. Consists of 1.7 million solar panels spread out over 13 kilometers or 3,200 acres. And for context, that's about the size of 142 football fields, or 4 times the size of Central Park. Produces 579 megawatts of energy and enough to power about 255,000 homes. What we're seeing now, the growth in solar on the national level, we're seeing larger and larger facilities being located across the country. This is an aerial plan view of the planned Mammoth Solar Project, which would be in Stark and Pulaski counties, Indiana. And if constructed, it would, once constructed, it would be the largest in the United States. The 3 phases total approximately 13,000 acres, approximately 2,500 acres under solar panel, approximately 2.85 million panels, generating 1,560 megawatts, approximately 1.56 gigawatts, enough power to generate to power nearly 250,000 homes. And again, it would be the largest facility in the US if completed. So looking at national conditions and the growth of solar at the state level, these graphics really highlight this change. On the left, you have the top 10 states for solar capacity in 2012, and on the right, the top 10 states in 2022 through the second quarter. And it's really interesting to look at the states leading in 2012 and compared to those leading today. And it's also interesting to look at the growth in installed capacity. With the exception of California, almost every other state in 2012, their total installed capacity, we're seeing projects today that are as great as the total installed capacity within the states in total in that year. And you can just look at the changes in California alone, going from approximately 1,000 megawatts in 2012 to 37,000 megawatts in this year, to see how much the capacity for solar has grown in that time. Of course, Virginia has popped up in the top 10, and we'll talk a little bit about those circumstances and what we're seeing at the state level. So solar has grown in Virginia in the last decade, as that previous slide highlighted. Increased capacity from 17 megawatts in 2014 to 3,845 in 2022. From a geographic and climate perspective, the state is an attractive place for the installation of solar, but also from a policy and regulatory perspective, it's attractive. In 2018, the state's energy plan called for targets of 3,000 megawatts of solar and onshore wind capacity to be deployed by 2022 and 5,500 megawatts by 2028. In 2020, the state adopted what's known as the Clean Energy Act, which required Dominion Energy Virginia and American Electric Power, also known as Appalachian Power. These are the state's two principal utilities, required those utilities to produce 100% of their electricity from renewable sources by 2045 and 2050, respectively. These factors have contributed to interest in development of solar generation throughout the state and certainly serve to push the state's trajectory for installed solar upward. These images on this slide are from a recent solar survey of local government that was conducted by the Virginia Department of Energy and the University of Virginia. Shows the location of active facilities, 5 megawatts and greater throughout the state as of the end of the year 2021, as well as the annual growth in generation capacity since 2015. And I would say with respect to the state, what we see are, if you look, I don't think you can see my cursor, but the center of the state on the south side of the state, that is where we're seeing a lot of the activity at present, and a lot of our clients are client localities are in that general area. It's a lot of former ag land, current ag land, but former ag land, rural communities, lower land values, existing transmission infrastructure. So there's certainly a lot of activity in that area. So what that kind of points to, drilling down from the state level to the local level, we see projects like this. So this is the planned and recently permitted Randolph Solar Project in Charlotte County, Virginia, and Southside, Virginia. Recently received land use permit approvals. Project is planned to have a rated capacity of 800 megawatts and was planned for 21,000 acres. The image on the left shows the proposed layout, while the image on the right shows the location of the project parcels within the context of the entire county. And ultimately, we expect that the facility will have between 4,500 and 5,000 acres of fenced panels and a project area of 10,000 acres. This would by far be the largest project in Virginia, and as far as we are aware, the largest project on the East Coast currently. We assisted the county in the review of this project, and we'll go through how we approach utility scale solar projects like this at the local level. And I do want to mention, this is not the only project in this county. There are several other projects, and with the approval of this project and another one in the northern area of the county, they're going through exactly what we're going to talk about, which is they're seeing projects come through like this where perhaps their policies and their regulations don't align with their perspectives about how these projects should be developed in the county, where other projects should go, and their sizing of them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Luke to introduce our approach and discuss the planning and policy phase.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Michael. So yeah, it's important to understand that while solar projects are massive, they happen at the local level. You know, developers have to work with local county staff. They have to meet with individual property owners to make land deals years in advance of actually getting a project off the ground. And they have to follow each individual locality's regulations. And one would think that because it's huge and it deals with energy, the state would be handling solar, but really it comes down to local boards and planning commissions. And what that means, especially for protecting wildlife and the environment, because overarching state laws don't always, is that local governments should plan ahead before these applications come in. The ideal approach would be for a community to proactively work to address utility scale solar from a policy standpoint, which would then inform the development of land use regulations, which would then result in compliant and desirable projects that could be permitted. The pipeline would look like you already know what you want and where. You get an application, there's public input, ordinances set the ground rules, special use permits provide more specific rules and accountability, construction permits keep that in check, and then predetermined monitoring, bonds, and sureties kind of ride you through the life of the project, with each step of that kind of reinforming the others. What often happens, however, is a locality is either completely blindsided by large solar development applications, or they've previously only permitted, smaller sites where suddenly they have interest from developers for a 1,000-acre solar facility. Or they've already permitted a large facility that had undesirable or unintended consequences, and they are reactively changing their regulations to be less outdated, less broad, less ambiguous. 100 or 1,000-acre facility has a much greater land use impact, which isn't always apparent on paper. Next slide, Michael. So principally, local land development policies are addressed in a community's comprehensive plan. There might be other types of plans that inform actions and decisions around solar, like a renewable energy action plan or an economic development plan. But in general, a comp plan is a locality's first line of defense in setting out long-term planning goals that protect the interests of a community. And if a community is considering allowing utility scale solar, they should consider establishing policies that address it and its impacts and its relationship to the community's other policies, goals, and objectives. And when we start to work with the community, the first thing is to look at the comp plan and see whether it even addresses solar, which if it doesn't, that's an obvious starting point. But we also want to understand their overall vision, goals, and objectives so that we can align solar policies with those goals, plans, and objectives. Plan elements concerning future land use and development are also important to understand. Solar facilities stick around for 30 or 40 years, and as we've already seen, take up a whole lot of acreage. And so what types of commercial and industrial growth are desired by a community, and where are these land uses intended to be located? And what the comprehensive plan says about agriculture, preservation of natural and historic cultural resources, scenic landscapes, rural character, and similar assets. Often comprehensive plans will have designated growth areas or other zoning overlays that determine where they want certain kinds of development to go, which can let you keep solar out or put solar into places you want it. And it's sometimes addressed in the comprehensive plan, but it's also important for a community to consider and just be aware of the fiscal needs and goals and the interest in economic development and in job creation. And we try to balance those considerations with sound land use planning practices. Of course, in reality, sometimes the finances outweigh land use principles. But so the sources of revenue for localities are real estate taxes, machinery and tools taxes, sales on local purchases, and also proffers if it's a rezoning situation. But you also need to look at applicable federal and state financial incentives for solar, the intent of which is to act as an economic catalyst to encourage the development of green energy. But the unintended consequence is that sometimes the solar industry is saving money by not having to pay local taxes, and the localities aren't getting the full tax revenue. And the projects themselves might create local jobs during construction, or the imported construction workers will need housing, food, entertainment. And there's the obvious positive fiscal impact to the landowners and especially farmers who sell or lease their land. But the fiscal impact overall to the community is less clear. And in the case of a lot of localities, kind of negligible due to these tax credits and the low long-term job creation. You know, solar has a kind of economic force behind it, but once they're built, they really only employ a couple of people to come mow the grass every once in a while, and they don't really spur other business development. And so in terms of specific comprehensive plan policy considerations, these usually focus on the specific size, the appropriate scale of solar facilities, where they should be located, for instance, if they're preferred on industrial land or brownfields as opposed to agricultural lands. Of course, commonly we see agricultural, forested, and undeveloped lands as the likely site. But generally we'll work with the community to identify those assets and the growth potential of certain areas, and then determine policies that establish, you know, preferred and less preferred outcomes as far as land use is concerned. And the way to do this is through specific metrics indicating where you want to consider them. You know, locating them on like brownfields, like closed landfills, capped landfills, or old coal sites, within a mile of transmission lines, and also indicating where you don't want them. So a certain distance from cities and towns and growth areas, or a minimum distance from other solar sites to minimize the density of that one use. And then avoiding prime farmland and forest land, as well as residential areas, historic areas, cultural resources, and your most environmentally sensitive areas. And comprehensive plans are generally more broad, and they'll use language such as the community has a desire to protect golden eagles, which might be at odds with other broad statements, such as the community wants to encourage economic development and sustainable logging and forestry. But there are ways to handle that as well. And in Virginia, in light of recent regulations that are going to give the Department of Environmental Quality more control over protecting prime agriculture and forest land, the Nature Conservancy developed a map that answered whether there's even enough non-prime land available to meet the state's 100% renewable energy goals. And this map looked at, you know, keeping it within 3 miles of a high capacity transmission line, looking at land that wasn't too sloped, of course, land that isn't already developed, no prime forest land, no prime agriculture, staying away from wetlands and rivers and other water resources, and then preferentially putting them on brownfields, and also avoiding biodiversity hubs. And they determined that, yes, there technically is plenty of more desirable places that solar could go. What's missing from this map, however, is the local context. You know, landowners with land that they're willing to sell and localities that are amenable to development and have easy and clear rules and regulations to follow. So it's difficult to capture something this specific in a comprehensive plan, but I'm going to hand it back to Michael to discuss how more specific protections can be put into the process.
Thanks, Luke. So once a community sets policies, and as Luke highlighted, it doesn't always go in this natural process. This is probably ideal. But once communities set their policies, we can then look at distilling those into the development regulations, which are usually addressed in zoning ordinances. You know, principally this involves defining the different types of systems and the sizes of systems and related terms. A lot of technical terms that we want to make sure are in locality ordinances. Determining whether or not the use is allowed as a principal use, meaning that is generally the singular primary use of a property, or whether it can be allowed as an accessory use. Oftentimes with a lot of the applications we see, farmland is only a portion of a farmland site. An ag site is being leased for development for utility scale solar, and that that farmer is actively farming other portions of that property. So that needs to be a consideration. Also associated components, as we talked about, substations and the like, but also battery energy storage. Is that a use that the community wants to allow in conjunction with these facilities? We also want to make sure we identify the zoning districts where the use can be allowed. Usually communities are looking at industrial zoned land as well as agricultural zone land or rural residential zoned land. And then what are the permitting requirements for the use? Commonly with utility scale solar, they're being subjected to discretionary zoning permits. So conditional use permits or special use permits. And the ordinance would also want to specify application materials that are unique to these projects, whether that be plans, specific reports, such as traffic studies addressing the development phase, reports that may assess and analyze and inventory environmental and historic resources, anticipated impacts, and plan mitigation. And then we also want to develop explicit and ideally objective development and performance standards that control the siting and design of projects. And finally, we want to make sure that we're addressing decommissioning. What are the requirements for the removal of the facility and its components at the end of its useful life? And planning for decommissioning, we want to make sure communities are starting up front, that they're putting bonds in place that would cover the costs, the estimated cost of decommissioning these facilities, that they're putting those in place at the time that they're constructing and developing these before they're fully operational. So for the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on development and performance standards primarily. Often what we are recommending are specific setbacks, given the unique circumstances, unique design of these uses. Usually they're going to require increased setbacks from roads and external property lines greater than you would commonly see in the underlying zoning district. In some cases, some communities want specific setbacks from abutting dwellings for equipment. And additionally, we also see distances specified from municipal boundaries so that there's a buffer of a mile or two that facilities cannot be developed in areas that may see growth from those urban areas, from those municipal boundaries. Some communities also have required distances where facilities have to be set back and certain distances from other facilities as well. Height limits specify the maximum permissible height of system components and panels, but we also consider it a best practice to also specify the maximum height at the lowest edge of panels to lessen the effects of stormwater sheeting off panels and resulting in erosion. Lot coverage standards usually specify the total area or percentage of a site that panels can occupy. These standards may regulate, or these regulations may distinguish between total lot coverage as well as the area of panel coverage. And we also see area and density limits specifying maximum area to be utilized for solar development, either individually, where a project could be, let's say, capped at 1,000 acres. But we also see communities, counties having an aggregate maximum for all projects. For instance, where no more than 8,000 acres could be developed as utility scale solar. And we've seen that regulation, that maximum area limited within a defined area. For instance, one community we work with, no more than 3% of the land area within a 5-mile radius can be utilized for a solar facility project. So these regulations are very much related to established policies guiding the county's perspective about growth of solar throughout the county. We also see regulations, or we support regulations for fencing and security, and those go hand in hand with wildlife corridors, making sure that wildlife corridors are incorporated within projects. Regulations will also ideally establish requirements for buffers and screening to maintain or reduce impacts to view sheds, as well as site landscaping, which should address the establishment of appropriate ground cover. And we suggest that these regulations specify the uses of existing vegetation for buffers and screening where possible, and that any plant species be non-invasive and native to the locality. We have not necessarily specified the use of pollinators, but it's good to see that the development community, as well as designers of projects are working to incorporate pollinators within their projects. And then finally, there are regulations that address specific project location or site conditions. These standards may describe conditions that solar developers must establish or preserve, or conditions that may be incompatible with solar development. These may include standards related to soil quality, such as prohibitions on the disturbance of prime ag soils, standards related to historic or cultural resources that may be in the area, requiring alternative project designs, enhanced buffering or setbacks or studies, and standards related to natural resources, including requirements to retain and avoid mature stands of trees, or to establish buffers and avoid impacts to wetland and water resources. We also work to recognize and acknowledge existing regulations that may affect project siting and design. These can be both state and local. For instance, if there are existing local tree preservation, habitat protection requirements, certainly local and state erosion control and stormwater management standards. If those are in place, there's often not a need for us to specify regulations and standards for those things. But locally, in some cases, those ordinances and regulations don't exist. And we would either want to address them in the regulations or as part of individual permits. And we'll get into that in a second. I would say that in some cases, communities, stakeholders in communities, given varying perspectives, they can see regulations that are developed as overly extensive, but they do aid in predictability, both for the community as well as developers of solar facilities. And hopefully that projects that initiate permitting demonstrate compliance with all required regulations and explicitly address more subjective standards. I think going back to the slide that Luke showed, where communities are being more reactive, I think what we do see are communities that have not reassessed their policies or reassessed their regulations being presented with projects that are less ideal in their perspectives, given what they now know about them and now believe their policies and goals and objectives should be for the community. So, when we walk through this, it's, we present it as a really seamless and non-controversial process, but I think that's not often what we see because of some of these projects catching communities by surprise in terms of their size and scale. So moving from regulation development into the permitting of projects, this is going to be community specific. More often than not, utility scale is subject to discretionary zoning permits. Depending on the locality or the state, that's usually a conditional or special use permit that's required to be reviewed by one or more local boards with certain findings to be met, usually at least a determination that the proposal is consistent with the comprehensive plan policies before it can be approved. The alternative approach is that a project or use is determined to be by right, meaning that no discretionary permit is required, that the project can proceed directly to administrative permits. With larger projects, utility scale projects, that's less common. And usually conditional use permits, special use permits are reserved for uses that their operation, their size, their scale has impacts that are unknown, that are very location specific, or that they're so unique to each each proposal that they really cannot be anticipated. The impacts cannot be anticipated. So they are reserved for this additional level of review, discretionary review. Some states and localities may require a specific additional review of public utility projects. which utility scale solar is often considered. In Virginia, with most of our clients, we advise that they conduct a separate 2232 review prior to considering the discretionary zoning permit. And the 2232 is the number of the state code section that allows for localities to separately consider whether a proposed public utility project is located and designed in accordance with their comprehensive plan. And again, going back to the importance of setting policies specific to these facilities in their review. If discretionary permitting is successful, the applicant may then proceed to more detailed site and construction permitting. And focusing on discretionary permitting, we obviously want to ensure that the project meets objective regulations of the ordinance. But as a discretionary permit, we work with localities to use our judgment to determine whether a project meets subjective standards and required findings, usually through considering consistency of the project with policy and standards, by considering the unique circumstances and details of the project. So for instance, what that review or what some aspects of that review look like, we consider whether the change in land use is appropriate given the area and the location of the project. Are lands being converted from ag use or forested land? Is the project in close proximity to residences or growth areas? Is the land former industrial land or planned for industrial growth and perhaps more active job creation than would commonly be expected from a solar facility, as Luke mentioned earlier? Does the proposed site or development impact more sensitive areas, such as prime farmland, ecologically sensitive areas, historical sites, or areas planned for growth? And is the project designed to lessen visual impacts? Is it properly screened? Does it fit into an existing landscape? Does it affect scenic view sheds? Is it near transmission infrastructure, existing transmission infrastructure, thereby reducing the need for additional extensive transmission infrastructure upgrades? And what are the environmental impacts? For example, does the design account for the movement of wildlife or reduce wildlife mobility? Does it propose development on steep slopes? Will grading and land disturbance expectations impact natural resources? And does the project adequately plan for controlling, managing, and maintaining stormwater runoff? And I'll reference, recently we were looking at a project, and the standard regulation with respect to wildlife corridors is that a project needs to be designed to incorporate wildlife corridors, areas between fenced pods of solar panels, to allow for wildlife movement. And this image at the bottom is intended to show that. This one project that we were looking at, they had fenced areas, one of which was approximately 2 miles in length. And yes, they checked the box in terms of the regulation in that they had wildlife corridors demonstrated on their plan. But from a discretionary review, we posed the question of whether or not that was an ideal outcome to have a fenced solar pod that was so significantly large, impacting natural resource areas, because there also were streams and other wetland areas, natural areas for wildlife corridors that were in that area. So we do look at that in terms of, okay, you've checked the box in terms of the regulation, the standard, but are you really meeting the letter of the standard? Are you consistent with policies respecting the design of the project? And in that same vein, we continue to learn. You know, again, we're not, we're generalists in a sense, but we want to be aware of all of the issues that that we can see with these projects, environmental issues included. And in the last year, the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources has released some guidelines for the design of solar facilities. And one of the things, or several of the things taken out of that, they talk about recommended heights for fencing, where fencing should be low enough to either allow deer primarily to jump the fence, or it should be sufficiently high where deer are dissuaded from even attempting to jump the fence. What they don't want is for fencing to be between that height where deer could be ensnared in the fencing. They also talk about having tunnels under fencing for smaller wildlife to access and cross the site. And they also talk about having fenced pods, that their recommendation is that there be fenced pods no greater than 40 acres in size. And we've not yet had the opportunity to kind of roll those suggestions, those guidelines out into a discussion with the community, and see how they react to those from a regulatory standpoint. They did come up in the review of one project, and the community was less inclined to condition a project to the letter of those guidelines, but we alluded to them in the conditions for that project, that that the applicant, to their, I guess, best possibility to look to those guidelines to design wildlife corridors for the project. So through our review, we eventually develop a recommendation and recommended conditions for a project. Not every time do we recommend favorably on a project. Usually what we try to do is see if we can develop conditions to mitigate for negative impacts and presumed negative outcomes. I would say it's rare that we can't come up with a condition that would resolve an issue or a perceived issue. But the conditions, we hope that they're unique to every project, that they're intended to address unique identified issues that require mitigation or anticipated impacts. But there are some common themes. And these commonly include conditions that would require subsequent plan submittal after the discretionary permit during the development phase. For instance, erosion and sediment control and stormwater plans, construction mitigation plans. We also impose conditions or recommend conditions be imposed that limit the operation of the facility or require certain things during the operation of the facility. For instance, ongoing maintenance of equipment, maintenance of landscaping and buffers. Conditions also are recommended regarding traffic mitigation, especially during the construction phase. You know, that project I showed earlier in Charlotte County, Virginia, 800 megawatts, I think the construction phase alone was going to last 5 years, and the number of trips, and these are, you know, that facility, a lot of rural small roads where you're going to have a lot of construction traffic on those roads, and it's not common, obviously, and so what are they going to be doing to control and mitigate for those that traffic, as well as improving road conditions that may be damaged as a result of construction activity. We also want requirements for the eventual decommissioning of the facility addressed in conditions, the security of the facility, the training for emergency services personnel, especially with respect to fighting fires that may be associated with battery energy storage. There is specific training and technical information that needs to be relayed to emergency services personnel. They need to be provided access, ensure that they're provided access to the sites. And then we also want to address how violations of conditions will be addressed and resolved. So once the discretionary permit is approved, the project can proceed to the development phase, subject to standard construction permitting and inspections, and then commissioning and operations. And then hopefully the outcomes of the project are consistent with the county's long-range planning and policies and conform to the regulations and standards, and are operated and maintained in compliance with regulations and permitting conditions. And that generally is the overview of our involvement and experiences. And, you know, I think we just kind of touched the surface here. We can certainly be happy to respond to any questions. And if anyone would like to reach out, here's our contact information. If there's anything we can help you address and answer questions on, we're happy to do that. So thank you again.
No, thank you. And again, thank you so much, Michael, Luke, and Lindsay in spirit for taking the time to be here and present to us. I know I at least selfishly have one question, and then I will, open it up to anyone else who wants to unmute and ask. So when you're developing these local ordinances or comprehensive plans, I guess my question is, what stakeholder input are you taking in when developing these items, just especially with the terms of there are so many aspects to developing a solar facility from both an environmental perspective, from a regulatory perspective, but also from the development side, costs and things like that, especially as we see that are related to screening requirements and landscaping, and making sure that those are actually successful, determining those seed mixes, and who are you all getting involved when you're trying to develop these so that they're actually successful regulations?
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of the technical input, comes from our experience, I would say. And we certainly want public input broadly, from the community on the relevance of the regulations, the importance of the regulations. And I think it depends on what stage of interest exists for that particular community as well. We've worked maybe more proactively with communities where we have less involvement from the development side in that process, but we've also worked with communities where there was already a heightened level of development interest, and landowners involved in that potential development interest, the developers themselves, utility companies, have been heavily involved in the development of policies and regulations and input on those policies and regulations and the eventual outcome of those. So, I would say as a planner, we strongly encourage public engagement. We want to make sure all of the voices are heard. The best outcome is one where, we balance all of the competing interests and come up with solutions that are in the best interests of everyone. I mean, it would be easy if a community didn't want solar utility scale. It would be quite easy for them to say, well, we don't want it. We don't want the use, or the maximum is, you can have no more than 100 acres. And that's it. But for the most part, the communities we work with, there's an interest in allowing for these. They see the fiscal benefit. They see the economic benefit. They see that there is some level of job creation benefit. There's some level of monetizing or increasing the value of lands that were presumed to be formerly less valuable. And so, we're balancing those with goals to also protect view sheds, environmental resources, cultural resources, and so it's tough conversations, but there is an ability to strike those balances, I think. And it's easier to do in a process that maybe we described here, where maybe there's less noise going through that process, and you're not simultaneously dealing with the review of applications while you're going back and revisiting policies and regulations. But that's what we see often. So
yeah.
And if I could add to that just briefly, we come in with our experience and expertise and kind of like anchor the best practices, what we think are best practices. But eventually what we're trying to get at is helping the community come to their own decisions about what's best for them. So, we kind of give them parameters that we think work and have worked for other people, but then they work that out on their own. And then as far as the community involvement, a lot of times where the rubber hits the road is at the special use permit meetings, as opposed to, developing the comprehensive plans and the pre-planning. Not very many citizens get involved with, planning at the staff level or even know that it's going on. Even when we work on comprehensive plans, we try to get charrettes going. We try to get as much public involvement as possible. But hardly any people ever even know that's going on. So that is one area where I think around the country,
Getting the public involvement is tough. Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, I think trying to get as much stakeholder engagement to help I guess, factually drive some of these regulations is really important, you know, on both the environmental aspect side of things and getting your Nature Conservancy, your DWR and things like that, actually driving some of these regulations might be helpful. And I know the community has a lot of opinions and thoughts and feelings on how certain regulations should be put into place, but I also know it's hard to get that community engagement. Mona, I see that you raised your hand, so yeah, go ahead.
Hi, yes, thank you. Very interesting presentation. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you for putting that together for us. The question I have is, I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey. We're a federal science agency, and we do some work on solar energy and wildlife impacts. And I was curious, what is a best way to help inform the best practices that are being implemented now? And I'm sure this is, it's a growing field, and there are a lot of communities where this might be new to them, some that are already familiar. And so what are your recommendations for making the science more accessible, and then figuring out how to develop the science so that it can be applied in these situations? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we look to research case studies and the like, example projects, best practices. You know, we're gleaning everything from every project that we work on. It was interestingly enough, I got an email today from the U.S. Department of Energy, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and their Solar Energy Technologies Office. They just awarded funding for what's called their Deploying Solar and Wildlife and Ecosystem Service Benefits, their SOL Web. And this was research funding under that program that was intended to look at developing innovative solutions and strategies that maximize benefits and minimize impacts to wildlife and ecosystems from solar energy infrastructure. And they awarded, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different awards for different research. Great Plains Institute is very active in a lot of this, and we look to them as a resource. You know, they're actively evaluating the use of pollinators and sites and agrivoltaics. They were one of the awardees. Cornell University, Argonne National Laboratory, Wildlands Network, UMass Amherst, University of Arkansas, Sandia National Labs. So anything that comes out of something like that, we hope to inform. Well, one, we hope the industry's being informed, but we hope to inform ourselves so we can help serve our clients better, and that we can, you know, I think back to Jen's comment that we're not just developing a regulation that doesn't make sense for anyone, that it makes sense for the industry, that it's cost effective, cost efficient. That doesn't mean that it's not going to cost them more, but it's not that it's unrealistic from a financial standpoint to do X.
Yeah. Yeah, so just to share, we are participating in that as well through Cornell University. And yeah, I think these emails are one good way of letting the community know what's going on, what research is being published. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, congratulations on that award.
It's not me, but it's my colleagues. So I'm always rooting for them. But yes, thank you. And I'd love to add you to my listserv to keep you informed.
Please. Yeah, absolutely. We'd be glad to have that.
Thanks.
I do see someone just asked in the chat what document or organization you were just referencing. I guess that you guys were both just discussing.
Yeah, so let me screen share real quick and I'll show it.
And Jan, if we have just an extra minute, I would answer John's question in the chat as well.
Love that.
So this is the email. This is the website that the email goes to, but I would go to USDOE Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and you can sign up for updates, specifically from CETO, Solar Energy Technologies Office, or any of these other. There's a lot of really good programs, renewable energy focused programs out of the DOE. This program itself was announced, I think, last spring in terms of a call for proposals. And you go down here, it talks about the program, the objectives, but then the different awardees under different topic areas. So I would highly recommend that. You know, and again, Great Plains Institute, maybe that was more the question, but they are very active in research on best practices for solar development as well, in the nexus with wildlife and natural resources especially.
Great. Thank you for that. Luke, I know that you mentioned you wanted to go back to John's question. John?
Yeah, well, John in the chat asked if any of these regulations, all taken together, ever completely dissuade utility scale solar. And the answer is not really, especially the ones like height and wildlife corridors. You know, very often corridors will go in places where they weren't going to develop anyways, like a too sloped of a gully, or the wetlands, or the only one that really winds up stopping some solar development is if a locality decides to have density limits. It's kind of like when you looked at that map of Charlotte County, you know, the facility itself took up a huge chunk of the county. And there are a couple of localities that have decided, you know, they only want a certain percent of their total land to be used for solar. But other than that, solar projects are so profitable that they'll conform to a lot of regulations. And you know, we don't make the regulations to be anti-solar ever. It's just to protect the county's interests, and especially environmental interests.
Yeah, and I would also add to that. I mean, regardless of whether or not there's a maximum area for the county, there is a maximum area. If the county says we only want solar, utility scale solar developed in our agricultural zone land, well, there's a functional maximum there. So there's a point where you've reached your saturation point. And I almost had a disclaimer as part of the presentation. We're not opposed to solar. We completely support renewable energy, but every land use, you know, I'm a planner. I've been involved in planning at the municipal level for 19 years. And the community and its residents, again, they have to balance, everyone has to balance these different perspectives about what is appropriate development, solar included. And we've seen in Virginia, there are negative outcomes of projects where they were not perhaps properly reviewed, properly vetted, and those are having to be managed today. A lot of those are stormwater impacts that are degrading water quality and impacting stream networks. So, you know, it's important to manage these things, and not to mention, a current evaluation is in Virginia is the impact and the loss of forest land and ag land, and the impact that has on compliance with the Chesapeake Bay Act. So there's levels of things to balance here. And that's, you know, what we hope to bring to the table and for our clients.
Great. Well, thank y'all so much. I know we could probably sit here and ask 1,000 questions and talk about Virginia. Regulatory is a whole nother ballgame compared to the rest of the country. So I could talk about that for days. But we're over time. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. I did put a link in the chat to our YouTube channel. So I will be posting this probably early next week. So if anyone wants to go back, watch. And then Michael had also generously included their contact information in the slides. So you'll be able to find that and contact them if you have any other questions. But again, thank you so much, Berkley Group. We really appreciate y'all joining us today. And again, tune in next time, everyone. And thanks, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you for having us. Take care.
Thank you all.